Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 89 called Belisarius is Back. For Justinian's Roman Empire, the 540s were the opposite of the 530s. The 530s had witnessed a Roman recovery not seen since the Emperor Aurelian had restored the fractured empire of the 3rd century AD. But, like hammer blows falling, the early 540s brought one disaster after another. First, the Persian sack of Antioch in 540, then the bubonic plague in 541, and in 542 even Belisarius's Italian conquests were reversed as the new Gothic king Totila defeated the Roman army of occupation and recaptured town after town, reaching Naples in southern Italy by 543. So, what could be done? The answer lay with one man, the architect of Justinian's success. That man was, of course, Belisarius. In episode 85, we left Belisarius in Constantinople in late 540, having returned from Ravenna. Justinian had wanted him back in Constantinople for two reasons. First, he was worried the Persian Shah Khosroes was about to break the eternal peace. Second, he was probably perturbed by the news Belisarius had accepted the Goths' offer to be Emperor of the West, even if that was only a trick to help him seize Ravenna. Justinian was certainly right to be worried about Khosroes, but the Persians struck much sooner than he thought. While Belisarius was on the boat home, Khosroes was sacking Antioch. So let's pick up our story after that. As I said in episode 86, Khosroes celebrated the destruction of Rome's second city by going for a swim in the Mediterranean Sea, the first time a Persian king had done that for 300 years. Once Khosroes had dried himself off, envoys arrived from Justinian to negotiate a peace. Khosroes drove a hard bargain. He wanted £5,000 of gold, 5 times the amount he'd originally demanded to spare Antioch, as well as £500 of gold annually. The Roman envoys sped back to Constantinople to see if Justinian was willing to pay this huge sum. Meanwhile, the Persians agreed to wait for his reply and suspend hostilities. But as Procopius was only too keen to point out, Khosroes was not a man of his word. Despite agreeing to a truce, he didn't honour it. Indeed, he wanted a bit more fun at Justinian's expense. So he advanced south from the smoking wreck that was Antioch to the town of Apamea. There he demanded and received £1,000 of silver to spare the city, and he organised a chariot race in which he ensured the Greens won against the Blues, since he knew Justinian was famously a blue supporter. Procopius also tells us he nearly walked off with a portion of the true cross, which was the town's main religious relic, but probably not realising its significance, he let the town keep it. He then started the journey back to Persia, but at a conspicuously leisurely pace that allowed him to stop off at the Roman cities along the way to demand tribute. After Apamea came Chalcis, which paid him £200 of gold. Then Edessa paid another £200 of gold for him to leave, not, Procopius tells us, because its inhabitants were afraid the Persians would storm their tall walls, but because they wanted them to leave their crops in the countryside alone. At this point, envoys arrived back from Justinian to say, yes, he agreed to the payment of £5,000 of gold. But it seems Khosroes didn't trust Justinian to come up with the money, for he continued to break the truce and set about besieging Dara, the hugely powerful fortress the Emperor Anastasius had built to oppose the Persian stronghold of Nisibis. But the sturdy walls kept the Persians out. Their efforts to tunnel underneath them were skillfully defeated by the Romans when they dug an opposing tunnel to meet the Persians underground. Procopius tells us this was organised by a skilled engineer called Theodore. In fierce underground fighting, the Persians were sent fleeing. Chosroes gave up and accepted £1,000 of silver to depart from Roman territory in the winter of 540. Perhaps he should have simply taken the promised £5,000 of gold without attacking every Roman city he passed, since Justinian then refused to pay him when he heard what had happened. This left Chosroes with a considerably smaller sum, £2,000 of silver and £400 of gold collected after the sack of Antioch. But whether Chosroes had in fact shortchanged himself or not, it was still an utter humiliation for Justinian. Procopius says of the sack of Antioch, quote, "I become dizzy as I write about such a great calamity," end quote. Justinian had mismanaged his eastern frontier shockingly. But Roman hopes were soon to be revived, for by the fall of 540, Belisarius was back in Constantinople, mustering an army. And in the spring of 541, just months before the plague hit Pelusium in Egypt, Belisarius marched from Constantinople to meet the Persians. But his army was small, emphasising yet again how Justinian had run down the eastern field army. Procopius says he only had his own bucellarii, that is, his own personal bodyguards, including a contingent of Goths from Italy who returned with Witigis and who would prove their worth against the Persians, together with the Limitanii on garrison duty in the east and a force of Arab allies led by their commander Al-Harith. Procopius is scathing about the Limitanii, who presumably included those 6,000 who'd abandoned Antioch to its fate the previous year, describing them as, quote, "for the most part without either arms or armour and in terror of the name of the Persians," end quote. Justinian urged Belisarius to take revenge for the sack of Antioch by advancing on the Persian stronghold of Nisibis. This audacious move was prompted by the false information he'd received that Chosroes and the main Persian army were far away in the east, dealing with an attack by the White Huns. In fact, they were in Lazica, which is modern Georgia in the western Caucasus, where Chosroes' attention had been attracted by its inhabitants' appeals for Persian help against a corrupt Roman commander, Peter, who had monopolised imports of grain and salt to sell them at extortionate prices. This racketeering had occurred when Justinian strengthened Roman defences in this region in the 530s, building a powerful fortress at a place on the Black Sea coast called Petra, which is not to be confused with the Nabatean Petra, famously still visible in modern Jordan. Procopius tells us Chosroes led a large army into Lazica, spreading the false rumour that he was away fighting the White Huns, which was the story fed to Justinian, as I've just mentioned, so that he could launch a surprise attack on Petra. Despite his deception, the first assault on the Roman stronghold was so disastrous that, according to Procopius, Chosroes had the general in charge impaled as a punishment. But a second attempt, which mined underneath the town's walls, causing a tower to collapse, was more successful and the town was taken, with Chosroes displaying uncharacteristic mercy by sparing the lives of the defenders in return for their quick surrender. Meanwhile, back in Mesopotamia, Justinian was still urging Belisarius to avenge the sack of Antioch by attacking Nisibis. However, Belisarius was more cautious. He had little confidence in his motley army, and he knew Nisibis was held by a highly competent Persian general, Nabonidus. Procopius narrates an intriguing story in which Belisarius, ever the wise commander, had to rein in the enthusiasm of overconfident Roman officers who wanted to attack Nisibis. When one of them disregarded orders and was routed in a skirmish with the Persians, Belisarius had to intervene with his Gothic cavalry and put the Persians to flight. One senses Belisarius's increasing frustration with Justinian's inability to give him sufficient resources to get the job done. This had been the case in Italy, and it was even more so now on the Eastern Front. But resourcefulness was Belisarius's middle name. He abandoned the siege of Nisibis in search of easier prey, and he found a Persian fortress nearby, Caesorenon, garrisoned by 800 elite Persian cavalrymen, but a much softer target than Nisibis. Although his first assault failed, he let loose his Arab allies on the Persian countryside, and they returned with prisoners who said the Persian garrison was running out of provisions. With his gift for diplomacy, Belisarius negotiated a surrender, promising the Persians they would receive excellent pay if they switched sides to join the Romans. This they did, and the town was occupied, securing a small Roman victory. It wasn't quite the same as taking Nisibis, but at least it was a gesture of revenge for the sack of Antioch. With that, Belisarius called a halt to the campaign. Procopius tells us he had little choice, since not only had his Arab allies deserted to gather booty for themselves, but a disease he ascribes to the severe heat also suddenly afflicted a third of the Roman soldiers. This doesn't seem to have been bubonic plague, which would come later, and instead it was probably dysentery or something similar. In the secret history, Procopius also alleges Belisarius was desperate to join his wife, Antonina, to sort out a serious domestic dispute that had arisen. We're going to cover that at the end of the episode, so hang on for the moment and I'll tell you more. But the second year of war with Chosroes was now over, and it was quits between the two of them. The Persians had taken Petra in Lazica, and Belisarius had taken Caesorenon in Mesopotamia. He returned to Constantinople for the winter. The next year, 542, would be a momentous one. Not only did the plague work its way up to Constantinople by the summer, but in spring, Chosroes launched another major invasion of Mesopotamia, with an army probably similar in size to that which he'd taken to Antioch. His target this time seems to have been Jerusalem. His route was the same as in 540 along the Euphrates. First stop was the city of Serdupolis, which successfully resisted the Persian hordes and was fortunate enough, Procopius tells us, for the enemy to run out of water and to have to move on. Meanwhile, Belisarius had arrived in Syria and taken command of the army of the east. This time he seems to have had additional reinforcements, although none of our sources give any detail on the numbers involved on either side. He set up camp near Europaeum, further up the Euphrates, ready to intercept the Persians. But Chosroes never got there. Lovers of military history can only regret that a third encounter between Belisarius and Chosroes didn't take place, since their score so far was even, with one victory each. Belisarius at Dara and Chosroes at Callinicum. Who would have won the third encounter? Well, we'll never know, because the Persian army simply retreated back the way it had come. So why did Chosroes retreat? Procopius provides us with a rather fantastical explanation. He claims it was Belisarius' resourcefulness that once again saved the day. The story goes that Chosroes sent his royal secretary Abandones to the Roman camp to demand the £5,000 of gold he'd been promised after the sack of Antioch. Procopius says Belisarius wanted to trick him by making his army look much larger and more intimidating than it really was. So he spread it out over a huge area. Then he surrounded himself with, quote, 6,000 men of tall stature and especially fine physique, end quote. These were picked from various Roman regiments, including native troops like Thracians and Illyrians, but also a large contingent of Goths and Vandals now serving in the Roman army. These men were told to look as if they hadn't a care in the world, certainly no fear of the Persian army close by. Quote, each one had his horsewhip, and for weapons one had a sword, another an axe, yet another an uncovered bow. All gave the impression they were in a hurry to be off on a hunt, with no other concern in their minds. End quote. Procopius says this display of confidence and strength had the desired effect. The Persian envoy returned to tell Chosroes, quote, he'd met a general who in manliness and wisdom surpassed all other men, and soldiers, such as he at least, had never seen, end quote. But most historians think another explanation is more likely. The plague was now raging throughout Constantinople and the rest of the empire. Our records provide almost no details about its effect on Persia, although Procopius does say that its ravages were also felt there. So Chosroes' army may well have already been suffering its effects, even though Belisarius' troops seem to have been spared, at least for the time being. Even if neither army was directly affected by the plague, both sides knew something much bigger was happening, and it would be unwise to risk a titanic battle. Perhaps another reason was Chosroes' fear of Belisarius, for his reputation was now at its height. So the Persian king of kings retreated to Persian territory, although he stopped on the way to burn Callinicum, which the Romans were in the middle of refortifying and had left mostly deserted, apart from a group of farmers who, Procopius tells us, found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time and were hauled away by the Persians as prisoners. Thus ended the third year of the Persian War, and the next year it fizzled out completely, at least in Mesopotamia, because fighting did continue in Lazica until the 550s, which we'll cover in a future episode. But in 543, Chosroes launched his last attack in Mesopotamia, targeting Edessa. This was a powerful fortress. Procopius has left us with a very detailed account of the 2-month siege. The Roman general Martinus put up a determined resistance. Repeated Persian attacks on the walls were beaten off. Procopius describes boiling oil poured onto the Persians as they scaled the walls. When they tried to build up an artificial hill against the walls using tree trunks, stones and earth, the Romans sallied out and poured more oil onto the wood and set it alight so that the smoke, according to Procopius, could be seen 50 miles away. Eventually, Chosroes abandoned the siege for the payment of £500 of gold and returned to Persia. So, where, you might well ask, was Belisarius while this was going on? The answer is that he was in disgrace. And we now need to address one of the most perplexing issues raised by Procopius in his writings, and one that has attracted much scholarly ink. That is the subject of the alleged infidelity of his wife Antonina, and how this, together with Justinian's catching the plague, led to Belisarius's disgrace and near execution. As you well know, Procopius has left us with two versions of Justinian's reign. The official and largely objective account in the wars and the buildings, and then the controversial and highly scandalous account in the secret history. And as I've mentioned before, I think it's the secret history which, being short and vitriolic, and often dismissed because of this by historians, actually provides us with some of our best insights into this period. The secret history starts with Belisarius, and you're in for a shock. The hero of Procopius's wars is described as a fool, cuckolded by his scheming wife. Hang on, I hear you say, are we talking about the same person? Is this the same Belisarius, who Procopius repeatedly assures us is not just the greatest soldier of his age, but a man of brilliant intelligence? And with his wife, are they not the perfect couple, as Procopius wrote in the wars? Quote, "He never touched any woman other than his wife, although he took captive so many women from both the Vandals and the Goths, and such beautiful women as no man in the world, I suppose, has ever seen. He refused to allow any of them to come into his presence or meet him in any way." End quote. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but in the secret history, Procopius reveals a very different side to Belisarius' wife and their marriage. He says, before Antonina met Belisarius, she had, quote, lived a profligate life and, quote, given birth to one child after another. He says her mother, quote, had been one of the theatre tarts. But none of this stopped Belisarius from being devoted to her. According to Procopius, he was far too devoted. Quote, she had her husband wrapped around her little finger. End quote. Antonina was also politically powerful in her own right because she was best friends with the Empress Theodora. And as you know, Theodora also had Justinian wrapped around her little finger, so much so that Procopius tells us she told the Persian ambassador that Justinian wouldn't think of taking any action without her approval, which not surprisingly caused much amusement in the Persian court. Procopius's central allegation, which he reveals in the secret history, is that Antonina was having an affair with her adopted son Theodosius. The background to this is that Belisarius and Antonina only had one child, a daughter named Ioannina, although she also had one legitimate child from a previous marriage called Photius, and, we're told, an unnamed daughter. The reason she and Belisarius had no more children is probably because Belisarius married her very late by ancient standards when she was already in her 30s, and he was younger, he was probably about 25, and also given her past life, she may have had a history of abortions, making it difficult to have more than one child with him. Because they had no son, they adopted a promising young man, presumably to be Belisarius's heir, named Theodosius, who was already serving in Belisarius's household. Then the problems began. He was a handsome young man, and Antonina fell in love with him. She always accompanied Belisarius on campaign, and during the Vandal campaign of 533, the two became lovers unknown to Belisarius. Procopius says this so shocked her natural son Photius that he plotted against Theodosius, who, fearful for his life, fled to a monastery in Ephesus. This upset Antonina so much that she turned against her own son Photius, who, to save himself from his mother's fury, finally enlightened Belisarius about the truth of his wife's misdemeanours. Not surprisingly, this caused their hitherto happy marriage to fall apart. At this point in Procopius' story, which I've kept to its minimum essentials and doesn't contain many of his more salacious details, the Empress Theodora tried to save her friend Antonina's marriage by first imprisoning Photius and then planning a way for Antonina to be reconciled with Belisarius. An idea came to her when Justinian himself was struck down by the plague in 542 and was expected to die. Not surprisingly, this sent the rumour mill into overdrive. Who would succeed Justinian? Belisarius was, of course, an obvious candidate. At this moment, he was on the Eastern Front, using his trickery to scare Chosroes, as I just mentioned. And a story spread that he and his general Bootses were overheard saying they didn't like the emperor and would never serve under someone like him again. When Justinian unexpectedly recovered his health in the winter of 542, Theodora told him this rumour. He was furious and immediately recalled Belisarius, stripping him of all his titles and wealth, and was on the verge of executing him. That was why Belisarius wasn't present when Chosroes launched his campaign against Edessa in 543, as I was just telling you. But after having whipped Justinian into a frenzy against Belisarius, Theodora stepped in and, proving her boast true, that she could wrap her husband around her little finger, she persuaded Justinian to drop all charges against Belisarius and reinstate him. She then told Belisarius, who was living in fear of his life in Constantinople, that Antonina had asked her to save him, which she'd done, and he should therefore forgive his wife. Procopius says Belisarius threw himself at his wife's feet, forgave her for her infidelity, quote, raining kisses on each ankle in turn. He declared that he owed his life entirely to her, end quote. The couple were reconciled and lived happily ever after. That is the truth, according to Procopius, which he says in The Secret History he could never have published without being arrested. It reads just like a soap opera of lust and intrigue. I'm sure if someone brought it to Netflix's attention, it would be their next drama. Scholars are divided on whether it's true or not. I think it was. There's no smoke without fire. There is, I suggest, normally some truth in most of the allegations Procopius made in The Secret History. And I don't find any contradiction in Belisarius being both one of the greatest generals in Rome's history and also having a very difficult wife who was probably unfaithful to him. And so, to return to our earlier narrative, by the end of 543, Belisarius was forgiven and restored to his former rank and glory. Then Justinian decided the Persian onslaught in the east was over, and he needed his greatest general to sort out the problems in Italy, where the Gothic king Totila was running amok. So, in the spring of 544, Belisarius sailed to Italy for his second campaign against the Goths. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And in the next episode, which will be in a week's time on the 25th of May, we'll continue with the amazing story of the age of Justinian. And in the meantime, I'd like to ask a favour. If you like the podcast, could you recommend it to a friend? And if you listen to it on Spotify, could you click the star rating? That would be great. And of course, do also check out my website, nickholmesauthor.com. Link in the show notes to find maps, blogs, and a free ebook. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.